In this video, I'm going to try and walk you through step one of the final project. And some of this is reaching into content that we haven't covered yet. And so I'm going to try and be careful there and not sort of expect that you're working ahead. And the way that I'm going to show this through a few different sort of methods, and I don't expect you to imitate all the things that I'm doing. It's more to sort of explain the idea of what we're trying to accomplish in step one in a few different ways. And so we have this checklist in the upper right corner, which I'm going to keep up for the things that I want you to do in step one. So there's 5 things. Read in the data into RStudio, identify your research question, choose a dependent variable, choose 3 independent variables, and be able to make a prediction, a reasonable prediction about the relationship of those independent variables to the dependent variable. And really, this is speaking to chapter 14 of the textbook, where we're using multiple variables to predict one dependent variable. And I realize we haven't covered that yet, or maybe we will have when you're watching this video. And so it'll make more sense as you move forward in the class. And so the first thing you want to do in developing a research question and choosing your variables is to look at the data. And I have this list of all of the variables we have in the Word document that I sent out. And there are 20 variables. And this might just seem like a really long list of names and descriptions. I can understand that. And so I also created these sort of tiles here in this PowerPoint, which we can move around as we start to think about and choose our variables. Reading the data into R is hopefully fairly straightforward at this point. It's reading data that I've put on GitHub in the same way that a lot of the data we use for exercises is. And so to read that into R, what you want to do is just copy and paste all of this line, copy it into a script, and when we run that, we create this new object with 238 observations, 238 rows, and 20 variables. And all of the names of these variables match what is in the Word document. We don't need to actually look at the data to pick out our variables. It'll be useful as you move forward. But for now, the big goal is to just make sure that you can complete that step, that you're able to access the data so that in 3 weeks, we're not rushing to try and figure out what do I mean by the data. It's just this line of code. If you put this line of code in your script and run it, you have the data. And that data is named DAT. DAT is just sort of a typical name that I use for data that I don't want to name something more creative. Okay, so copy this line from the final project description, copy it into R, and you have the data. You've read it in. So that's one step done. The bigger part of this, though, is figuring out your research question and choosing the 4 variables you're going to use in your analysis. That can be, I can't tell you which variable you want to study. I gave you a wide variety of variables, so try and hope that everyone could find something that they're at least a little bit interested in. But that can also create a daunting challenge if none of these sort of speak to an interest you have. If you're interested in healthcare policy, national health, right? These 2 variables, Health 1 and NatHel, might be of more interest. If you're interested in drug policy, NatDrug or GRAS might be of interest, right? Are you interested in why people support legalization of marijuana or not? If you're interested in issues relating to race, the NatRace and the RaceLive might be of interest. If you're interested in income inequality, there's a few variables related to that. If you're interested in voting, right, there's this variable vote 12. And so hopefully everyone can find something that they can at least put a few paragraphs together pretending to be interested in. And so the research question is constrained by the data you have. We're not going to, with these research projects, try and understand why the United States decided to use the Electoral College instead of the popular vote for the presidency, right? The research questions we can answer are constrained by the data that we have, by these 20 variables. You can't study something related to transportation policy because there's nothing about transportation in this data. So these are sort of the options you have. And the research question is further limited because all of this data is for individuals. And so any research question you can really answer is about individuals and their preferences. And so the research question, as I've sort of put up here, is sort of, you can sort of craft it to sort of read differently. But at its core, your research question is going to be, why do people blank? And you'll fill in the blank based on the dependent variable you choose. And so, are you interested in marijuana legalization? Well, then your research question is going to be, why do people support marijuana legalization versus not support it? If you're interested in sort of race policy, why do people support policy to help minorities or blacks? If you're interested in income inequality, why do people believe that income inequality is a significant problem? The question you ask is going to sort of be implied by the dependent variable. And so those two things are going to go together really well. And so it's sort of this back and forth of you should choose your dependent variable and you can kind of plug that into your research question. You wouldn't want your research question to be, why do people grass? Right? We wouldn't want to move this here sort of directly. Why do people grass? That's not a research question. It doesn't make sense, right? Grass is the name of the variable. But what grass tells us is whether the individual supports the legalization of marijuana or not, which lets us answer this research question, why do people support the legalization of marijuana? And so in sort of going through these videos, there's going to be a few more in the coming weeks where I walk through all the different sections of the final paper. It's easiest if I sort of am working through one topic, one consistent topic. And so for my final project, that's in air quotes, the final project that I'm going to develop alongside you, I'm going to focus on this question of the variable nat space. I'm going to use that as my dependent variable. Let me insert a label for that. Right, I'm going to use nat space as my dependent variable, which you can see the description of here. It's coded as 1 if the respondent agreed with the statement, the country is spending too little on space exploration. So my research question is, for this project that I'm developing, why do people think spend too little on space? And that's actually a little bit rough as an idea. It would sort of be better written. Let me actually go back to the blank, right? If I was sort of specifying what my research question would be, right? What predicts whether a person thinks we spend too little on space? So I have a dependent variable that can let me answer that research question, right? I know whether people think we spend too little on space. And so what I want with my independent variables is to actually be able to predict, to figure out what type of person thinks we spend too little on space versus what type of person doesn't think we spend too little on space. So I have my dependent variable chosen. And now I need to choose my independent variables. Independent variables. And so I could just choose my independent variables at completely random, but in the end, that's actually going to be a little bit obvious, right? I can probably tell if you choose your independent variables without thinking about it. And this is why I ask you to actually make a prediction for how the independent variable will affect the dependent variable. What we want to be able to think about is, do I think this person, based on the characteristic that I'm including, will be more or less likely to say we spend too little on exploring space? So I have the list of all of the other variables here. So this is the 19 remaining variables I have. And I can think about them each sort of working through them independently. So for party ID, right? I could start with party ID, which we have in the data. We have Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Do I want to use party ID to predict whether someone supports spending more on exploring space, or whether they would think that we spend too little on exploring space? Do I have a reason to think that there will be a correlation between those two things? Well, Democrats typically support more government spending. They support spending more on space, and exploring space will obviously have a lot of spillover benefits for the nation's scientific infrastructure. And so I can make the reasonable prediction that Democrats will be more likely to say we spend too little on space. And so I could include party ID. That would be a reasonable independent variable. I don't have to include it. There's other options, but it's one that I could include. I could think about degree, right? People with more education typically support more spending on science and exploration. They probably are sort of more financially comfortable, and so they may be less concerned with spending on sort of social services, and might be willing to have more of their tax money go to these sort of luxury things like space exploration, right? So I can make a reasonable sort of prediction for why college degree, whether your level of education, would influence your support for spending on space. Other variables might make less sense in that sort of prediction, right? So I could think about including support for legalization of marijuana, right? Does support for the legalization of marijuana help me make a prediction about whether people want to spend more on space exploration? I can't really say. I don't really know. And so it might be something interesting to sort of explore, right? To find out whether people that support legalization of marijuana want to spend more on space. Maybe people that smoke marijuana watch a lot of space documentaries and think it would be cool. But I don't know if there's sort of a reasonable explanation to make for that prediction. And it might not be that important, right? Knowing whether you support the legalization of marijuana might not help me predict whether somebody wants to spend more on space. And so I want to pick out three of these variables, three of these independent variables that'll help me to know more about my dependent variable. What I want to say though is don't let yourself get tripped up waiting too long to find the exact right combination of variables. Don't overthink this. We can change it, we can make revisions, we can think it through, right? Reach out to me as you're thinking this through if you get stuck. But the more important thing is to sort of start to move forward, right? Especially if it's just one of your independent variables. If you can interpret your variables correctly, changing those variables does not become a significant challenge, right? As we get sort of further along in it. Don't spend too much time just staring at the list of variables. It's one of those things that's easier to change once you've made the decision than making the decision might be. We can work through another sort of example of these steps using something other than spending on space. I don't know where that one came from. All right, so let's take this away. Right, so let's just think about, so we just had an election. Let's just think about voting. Let's say that I'm interested in voting, right? And suffrage and who votes and access to voting. So I could take this variable about whether you voted in 2012 and I can make that my dependent variable. And I could look at as sort of my research question, why do people vote, right? Or more specifically, or who votes? Right. What type of person is more likely to vote than another? And we've got a great group of variables to look at that, right? We could look at party ID. Are Republicans or Democrats more likely to vote? And this was from 2012. I don't know why that was the most recent variable that they had in the data, but it's what we've got. So were Republicans or Democrats more likely to vote in 2012? Were men or women more likely to vote in 2012? As you get older, do you become more or less likely to vote? in all of these variables, there's have some interest with something like voting, right? Whether you do trust people. If you trust people, are you more or less likely to vote? If you think that the income gap is too large in the country to become more or less likely to vote. And all of those sort of lend themselves to interesting predictions, right? I think that if people trust each other more, they're more likely to vote, more likely to participate in that sort of collective exercise of political efficacy. If they think that income gaps are getting too large, you can imagine that that might discourage people from voting because they think that it's pointless, that it's all rigged for the winners in society, and so why would they vote? With this again, with this first step, which I'm asking, or I'm giving you the opportunity to submit to me in about 2 weeks for a bonus towards your final project grade, is tell me that you were able to read in the data, pick out your dependent variable, use that dependent variable to frame a research question, right? How votes? That was supposed to be who votes, but more it would. But if I was actually writing that as a research question, I would say, what makes people more likely to vote? I would then identify my dependent variable. I'm going to use vote 12 as a dependent variable. I'm going to use party ID, trust, and ink gap as my independent variables. And this is what impact those 3 independent variables I think will have on the dependent variable, just to show me that you've thought that through a little bit and that you're not just choosing them at random. And that's all. At this point, you're ready to get started and running. And so that all leads right into the introductory section of the paper. It starts to build out the literature review. And so once you get this these first couple of steps done, I think you'll be well on your way with this project.